Why is this happening? That is one of the biggest questions that so many of you are asking. In this first series of episodes, I've been looking at a huge story that the media is blowing in so many ways, and that's coverage of Israel ever since the massacres by the Hamas terrorist group last October. I've been showing indisputable proof that the media follows different rules just for coverage of Israel. And these are rules that are designed to make Israel look like some sort of evil entity. I've explained that some news executives admit that they are trying to reach audiences that are radicalized against Israel, both around the world and some right here in the United States. They want to appeal to these people, so they play into that. But there's also something else that's crucial to understand. Inside news organizations, there is widespread belief in a false, negative stereotype. It's a myth strategically designed to make them do what they're doing, and it's working. Today, on They Stand Corrected, I'll tell you about that myth that's skewing coverage of everything you see, including dangerous, violent protests that are spreading across America, especially on college campuses. Also, two big tactics that the media uses to push that myth. These are tactics to watch out for in general, actually. They can show up on all kinds of issues. I'll tell you about those and how all this involves a Harry Potter star and Bill Maher, plus a little wisdom along the way from another comedian, Jordan Peele. All that today on They Stand Corrected. Hi, and welcome. I'm Josh Lebs. This is They Stand Corrected. As I record this, the first episodes have now been out for about a week, and I've been getting so many messages from so many of you. I will be sharing some of them here on the show.
This is Mindy from Carlsbad, California. Josh Leb's podcast, They Stand Corrected, stands alone in providing factual, researched, and unbiased information. This is what the media should be giving us, but they are not.
Thank you so much. This is from Samara Villasenora listening in Seattle. She says, could you please make the show a little longer so it's with me for my entire cardio workout? Love it. All right. Keep up these messages. Thank you so much. You know, I actually did a magazine cover story about exercise and body image stuff. I'll include that in the newsletter. A bunch of you are signing up to be paid subscribers of that newsletter on Substack, which is a crucial way to support this show. So thank you so much. It's super cheap for the first 36 days. I explain why in the newsletter. And I'll be thanking some of you by name in the upcoming episodes. I always check first if you want your name mentioned. And there is a safe place in the newsletter for you to share your thoughts without being attacked by random haters and spammers, which, as we all know, can happen when you post on social media. So check out the newsletter. All right, speaking of your thoughts, I'm now preparing the first episode about lying in U.S. politics as it can play out in the 2024 election. There is a whole new way to look at the media's role in all this. So, a question for you. What is the worst, most memorable lie you've heard from a politician that the media did not do an adequate job of correcting? Now, I know there are too many to count, but share yours on Substack if you join, and I will be sharing some of them here on the show. All right, today, a stereotype that is so popular that even very well-meaning people have become convinced that it must be true. There's a good chance that when I tell you this, you'll do a bit of a double take and be like, wait, no, that one is true. It must be true. I've heard it's true. The stereotype is this: the crying wolf myth about Jews. The false idea that Jewish people routinely call criticism of Israel anti-Semitic. That myth is deeply ingrained in our societal thinking. If some part of your mind thinks, wait, that must be true, let me ask you this. Without Googling, can you, off the top of your head, name any time that a Jewish leader or group said that criticizing Israel is somehow inherently anti-Semitic? I'll save you time. You can't, because there aren't any examples of that. I've been involved in Jewish causes my whole life, and I've never once heard anyone say anything like that, ever. It doesn't happen. In fact, Jewish people routinely criticize everything. Arguing is fundamental to our culture. We argue all the time. We criticize things. It's also just a fact that Israel has had larger per capita peaceful protests against its government than any protests in all of U.S. history. So everyone knows that criticizing a government is not anti-Semitic. The awesome activist Noah Tishby and comedian Chelsea Handler had a great little clip about this in an Instagram video.
Progressives should love Israel. Israel is the single consistent democracy and the only progressive country in the entire region. Do you like free speech? I like it. Being able to criticize your government? I like that part, yeah. Do that in Israel.
And do you like gay weddings? You have the fun kind without straight people? So does Israel.
They're hilarious. Everyone knows that criticizing a government is not the same thing as being anti-Semitic. In fact, in a survey by the Jewish Electoral Institute, the overwhelming majority of people, almost everyone, said you can criticize Israeli policies and even be considered pro-Israel. So not only is it not anti-Semitic to criticize, you can even be considered pro-Israel while criticizing Israel. There is also depressing data about this, though. In one poll in Europe, a third of people said that they believe that supporters of Israel use accusations of anti-Semitism to shut down criticism of Israel. Now, that's big for a negative belief about any minority group, but it gets worse, way worse. Only 1 in 10 knew that it's not true. The rest didn't know. Meanwhile, the European Network Against Racism specifically says that this crying wolf idea is a myth. But sometimes the media states this negative stereotype as though it's a fact. Here's a couple examples. In a story just a few days after the October 7th attacks, NBC.com wrote this, quote, "Liberal American Jews have long rejected attempts to equate criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism." So I asked NBC, what attempts are they referring to? What were these attempts? And they didn't send any, of course. Then the next month, the Associated Press said something similar. They said, criticism of Israel's policies and anti-Semitism have long been conflated by Israeli leaders such as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and by some watchdog groups. So they're saying, yep, this is what happened. So I contacted the AP and I asked for any examples, literally any at all. And of course, they didn't send any. It's this thing that everyone claims must totally be happening, but no one has any proof that it ever happens. Now, I will point something out. There is no question that every form of bigotry is at some point used in false accusations. Absolutely. Sometimes people are falsely accused of saying or doing things that are racist, sexist, Islamophobic, transphobic. But there is also a lot of real bigotry. People shouldn't be so quick to write off complaints of bigotry. In general, if they're hearing this complaint from someone that they respect or is worth listening to, what they should do is ask. There's this memorable quote from Jordan Peele. I heard him on Fresh Air. Here's something he said.
Part of being black in this country and you know, I presume being any minority is constantly being told that we're being too aware of race somehow. We're obsessed with it, or we're seeing racism where there just isn't racism.
People on the left have become very wary of writing off complaints of bigotry when it comes to racism and other forms of hatred, but not with anti-Semitism, because they believe this crying wolf myth. So how does all this play out in the news coverage? Here's the deal. When people like you, me, anyone, says to news organizations, you have a major problem with your anti-Israel coverage, that this is anti-Semitic to subject the one tiny little dot of a Jewish state to a totally different set of rules. When we say that, a lot of them don't listen because of that myth. They think, oh, there go the Jews again, calling all criticism of Israel anti-Semitic. This idea has been learned. It has been drilled into their minds. It's hard to get through to them and help them see that it is a real problem. There are two major tactics that news organizations use to push this myth. I'll tell you about those and why the media could not have been any more wrong about a Harry Potter star right after this. And we're back. Because some people in the media want so badly for you to believe this myth of Jews crying wolf, they misrepresent real-life instances of anti-Semitism. One involved the actress and activist Emma Watson. Here's a clip from MSNBC.
Emma Watson was labeled an anti-Semite by Israeli diplomats for merely posting a picture expressing solidarity with Palestinians.
Okay, first of all, this is a perfect example of how the media so often just don't fact-check things in general at all. Because, in fact, Emma Watson did not post anything. Here's what actually happened. An Instagram account in her name posted something. But if journalists took 5 seconds to click and look at it, they would see that it wasn't from her. It said that she had handed her account over to a, quote, anonymous feminist collective, whatever that means. Like the internet needs even more anonymity. Anyway, I did a column about this for the New York Daily News, which I'll include in the newsletter, but there are very strong arguments that the post itself was anti-Semitic. This was a couple years ago. It showed an image of a rally and expressed solidarity. And at first glance, you might say, oh, okay, solidarity with Palestinians. But those of us who know what was going on in that picture, those of us who know about that rally, are aware that the rally included anti-Semitism. There were people supporting Hamas openly with these signs and flags. There were people invoking Nazi imagery. So there are strong arguments that it was anti-Semitic. But some people were just quick to say, oh, there go the Jews again, calling something anti-Semitic that isn't, instead of asking. People who do this also have a couple of other fake victims that they love to cite. One is a former CNN analyst named Mark Lamont Hill. He was fired after he used a Hamas slogan at the United Nations. And some people say, oh, he just criticized Israel and got fired. See, that they have it exactly backwards. He was on CNN in the first place as a very well-known public critic of Israel. So it doesn't even make sense to say that he was somehow fired for it, because he was always like that and they hired him. He also has a long set of problems I could go into. He has praised Louis Farrakhan, who's one of the worst anti-Semites in America. He even refuses to acknowledge that Farrakhan is anti-Semitic. It's not even worth talking about further. And there's one more example that I'll share with you here. Cornel West, a few years ago, announced that he was not getting what he wanted at Harvard, and it was covered in the news as him not getting tenure. And he pushed the idea that it's got to be because his criticism of Israel, that could be behind the decision. Here he is saying this on ABC News, unchallenged, of course.
Well, it's very delicate, because as soon as you raise the issue, you're accused of being anti-Semite, anti-Jewish, and so forth.
Unreal. Now, he has admitted that he had no evidence to back up that claim. And as you probably know from the news these days, Harvard professors condemn Israel all the time. Some even teach anti-Israel lies in their classes. Harvard is a hotbed of anti-Semitic, anti-Israel craziness, and no one's getting fired over it. In fact, any kind of repercussions at all for straight-up anti-Semitism are lacking at Harvard. And by the way, his position wasn't even eligible for tenure. This is what happens when you put these alleged examples under a microscope. There is no phenomenon of people being fired or canceled or whatever for criticizing Israel. The problem is on the other side. People are wildly anti-Semitic, and then if you dare say anything about what they're doing, they say, no, they were just criticizing Israel. I have this image I made, which you can see in the newsletter. It basically says, them, we celebrate the slaughter of Jews. Us, how can you not see that's anti-Semitic bigotry? Them, there go the Jews again, calling criticism of Israel anti-Semitic. Hi, you kind of have to laugh. It's just tragicomic. But what I was just telling you about is just one of the two tactics. The other one is sneakier. It's called the straw man fallacy. And here's how it works. You pretend that your opponent is saying something that they're not saying. All right. And the media does this all the time. They pretend that there must be all these people calling criticism of Israel anti-Semitic, and then they invite guests to argue that concept as though that's somehow necessary. Here's MSNBC.
Is there room, Chris, to criticize Israel's military operation without facing those charges of anti-Semitism?
Well, there's two different things. Can you criticize Israel's military actions and a lot of its policies without being anti-Semitic? Yes. Can you do it without having some people accuse you of anti-Semitism? No, you can't.
Here's CNN.
if the government and policies of Israel are criticized, does that necessarily mean that somebody is criticizing Jews or is being anti-Semitic?
Absolutely not. And I think that's one of the fundamental problems with the discussion in this country to date.
They're making it seem like this argument is totally necessary, but they don't have anyone saying it in the first place. This tactic, the straw man fallacy, is used in various ways all the time, and it's good to watch out for it in any context. There's one example that sticks out in my mind because it was just so egregious and so obvious. This one is when the Daily Beast was interviewing Bill Maher. Now, Bill Maher had explained that he had looked at lots of opinion polls from Arab and Muslim societies, and he had seen where many people stand on certain freedoms and on the concept of death being an acceptable punishment of leaving the religion. All right, so he had talked about this. The reporter then asked him this, and I can't believe I'm even going to read these words. It's so ridiculous, but here's what the reporter asked. If Muslims are generally bad, then... All right, that's how the question began. And then the reporter went on to cite Malala, among other Nobel Prize winners. Really? He never said that Muslims are generally bad in the first place. That is the straw man fallacy in action. And by the way, a question like that kind of caves in on itself, because the reason that Malala is so brave is that she stood up to the Islamists in her society who were trying to roll back progress and prevent girls and women from having freedom. But anyway, now that I've pointed this out to you, you might start to notice it happening all the time. So, what can we do about this? That is coming up right after this quick break with happy music. Because hey, who doesn't like happy music? Thank you, Nextiva, the platform powering more than 100,000 businesses and billions of conversations every year. Nextiva integrates all conversation channels and powers personalized experiences at scale throughout the entire customer journey. Say goodbye to siloed apps and say hello to the unified customer conversation solution. Learn more at nextiva.com. With everything I've told you about in mind, think about how it skews coverage of what we're seeing right now, especially on college campuses. Violent, dangerous students who are threatening and intimidating Jewish students. These protesters are supporting terrorist groups and calling for attacks and calling for further terrorism. Jewish students and professors are unsafe on many campuses, including my alma mater, Yale. There was a report about a student stabbed in the eye by these protesters. Now, listen to what seems like a totally innocuous clip. Here's a little coverage from the BBC.
I've spoken to some of those Jewish students, and some of them did tell me that they have experienced anti-Semitism here on campus. One young man told me he was assaulted. Others tell me they're fearful of wearing the yarmulke around campus. But the the protest organizers tell me that those incidents are overblown, and they fear that anti-Semitism is being weaponized to shut down the protest.
At first, that might sound totally fair. Here's what one side said, here's what the other side says. But think about this. If any other minority was being subjected to physical attacks and intimidation and all these dangers, if Black or brown or Asian people were being attacked, would the media say, well, the other side says the instances are overblown? Of course not. But people in the media have for so long been conditioned to believe that dangers must be overblown. After all, that's what the crying wolf myth is. So they would be forcing the people creating these dangers to answer questions about why they keep going and what's wrong with them. But in this case, maybe the dangers are overblown. This idea gets introduced, even though it wouldn't be for other minority groups. And this crying wolf myth has been a fundamental part of these movements, including on college campuses, for years. A couple of years ago, the student newspaper at Harvard, the Crimson, their editorial board decided to support this anti-Semitic movement called BDS. It stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. It's all about singling out Israel for unique condemnation while ignoring the entire rest of the world. In this Harvard column, the editors did not include their names, so they have this anonymity, but they wrote this, quote, "In the wake of accusations suggesting otherwise, we feel the need to assert that support for Palestinian liberation is not anti-Semitic." Now, of course, they did not show any evidence of those accusations existing, There was a great response to this by a screenwriter and filmmaker named Jason Kessler in something called The Jewish Journal. Here's a clip from the audio version of his column.
But you're pretending that they were attacking support for Palestinian liberation. That's a weak, disingenuous tactic that, in my opinion, is unbefitting the editorial board of the Harvard Crimson. It's a textbook example of a straw man argument.
Bingo! The straw man argument is everywhere, including in newsrooms. It's a major reason that news executives, editors, and reporters don't hear us when we point out the institutional bigotry. It operates as a mental block. They reflexively reject any and all criticism based on the stereotype that Jews cry wolf. Here's what I've seen, personally. In many newsrooms these days, people take it very seriously if you say that they've done something that is Islamophobic or homophobic or transphobic or racist. But I kid you not, for many people, being called anti-Semitic is like a badge of honor. People will go around announcing that they were called anti-Semitic as though it somehow proves that all they were doing was being fair and critical in their coverage of Israel, because they believe there's this imaginary horde of Jewish people who make these false accusations. Sadly, even some Jewish people have come to believe it. There are some Jewish people who say, oh yeah, well, I criticized Israel and I was called anti-Semitic. Well, first of all, if the person saying that to you is worth listening to, then ask them why. Maybe you'll learn something. Maybe you mistakenly said something anti-Semitic. But also, everyone has been called something at some point. I have criticized the Squad in Congress for lying about Israel, not for their opinions, but for saying things that are false. And some people have then told me that I'm racist, which doesn't even make sense because no one's race had anything to do with me saying that. But whatever, that doesn't mean that I go around claiming that there's this minority group that constantly makes false claims of racism. We have to stop this myth. So here's what we can do. In the newsletter linked in the show notes, you will see text that you can copy and paste and send to any news agency anytime you see the straw man tactic used in any way, or anytime you see anyone in the media push this stereotype. Also in the newsletter, you can post links. You can send me links that I will then look into and fact check, and I can reach out to news executives. I do that all the time. And I keep hearing from people inside newsrooms that their leaders are listening to this show and paying attention, which is fantastic news. It's so good to hear. Unfortunately, a lot of people in newsrooms feel disempowered, like they can't make the big picture changes. And they're hoping that with your help, I'll be able to push from the outside to make things better. We have a long way to go, and I hope you can join us in this journey. I also want to mention we are starting to hear from sponsors of this show. Thank you so much for your interest. You can get all the information you need in the show notes or through my website at joshlevs.com. Now, before you go, press that share button and send this podcast to everybody you know. And if your podcast platform has ratings, then go give us a great rating. And Apple Podcasts has reviews, so give us a great review. It makes a massive difference, every single one. I will actually read some of them right here on the show. Thank you so much for being a part of this growing community here at They Stand Corrected. I'll see you next time.